but there's no one to vote for, what difference does it make?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to St. Mark's. My name is Alan Jones. I'm the pastor here at St. Mark's. It's great to see everybody here on this great evening. This is the last of this season's Moon Lectures. The Moon Lectures are named in honor of Bob and Dorrie Moon. Bob was a pastor who was often referred to as a militant pacifist here in this congregation years ago. And Dorrie, his wife, is still with us at 100 years of age, and so we celebrate her. She's an amazing lady, and talking of amazing ladies, it's wonderful to welcome Angela Davis here tonight. And it's also wonderful to welcome her sister, Dr. Fania Davis, who's sitting here in front. She's an attorney working in the area of restorative justice. Now, I know that many of you are here because you just know the name Angela Davis. And Angela's name is somewhat iconic in the American psyche. Lots of people know that name, and it immediately stirs up memories and emotions, and all sorts of things come from the past. And that's great. At the same time, we have a very extraordinary woman who's here with us tonight, who's somebody whose life was refined through a series of very painful experiences, but experiences that had great power, experiences that at one point took her onto the FBI's 10 most wanted list. I think you are the first Moon lecturer who has this distinction. So, and we take it as a badge of honor. And but in recent years, well, through that whole experience and since, Dr. Davis has been a very incisive thinker, a woman with a deep, tender heart that responds passionately to issues and to people in the world around her, and has inspired many other people to do the same, and challenged systems that neglect and offend, affront. And her work in recent years on restorative justice and through the whole abolition movement is just really very exciting. But I'll shut up now. Angela Davis.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here in this very beautiful space. I'd like to thank Pastor Jones and all of the organizers of this lecture, and special thanks to Mrs. Moon, whom I just met, for endowing the Moon Lecture Series. Well, first of all, when Pastor Jones introduced me as having been on the 10 most wanted list, I was in Oxford. When was it? I spoke there Wednesday night. I just got in yesterday night. And I spoke at one of the famous Oxford Union debates. So the student who introduced me asked me if there was something fun she could say about me. And I said, fun? I said, oh yes, you can say that I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. And of course, everybody laughed and applauded at the same time. It's interesting how history transforms reactions. Because 4 decades ago, that produced collective fear. So I'm very happy to see the responses these days. Let me first say that we meet at a very auspicious moment. People in Ferguson, in New York, in Washington, D.C., all over the country, in the Bay Area, and perhaps also here in the Sacramento area, and in other parts of the world, are in the streets at this moment, making known that they absolutely refuse to assent to racist state violence. They are saying, no justice, no peace, no racist police. They're saying that contrary to routine police actions, and regardless of the collusion of district attorneys with the police, they are saying that Black bodies do indeed matter. Black bodies matter. Black bodies do matter, and we will take to the streets and raise our voices until we can be certain that a change is on the agenda. I thought I would begin by looking at the assumption, the widespread assumption, that these responses, these demonstrations are spontaneous, as if all of this has occurred without the work of organizers and activists all over the country. Nothing really happens by itself. But why now? That is the question many people are asking. Why now? And I would like to suggest that we are, at this moment, experiencing a particular conjuncture, a particular historical conjuncture, a coming together of a number of conditions. So let us reflect on the fact that we are in the second term of the first Black president, and the proclamation of a kind of post-racial condition that was assumed by many to be a natural consequence of the first Black president. And let me say that although, of course, I voted for Obama, and I was moved by this world historical event that produced collective euphoria all over the world, I have to say that the most important dimension of that election in 2008 was, in fact, the movement that produced it. There were people all over the country, young people especially, who refused to believe that it was impossible to elect a Black president, even when many of us did not think that it would happen in our lifetimes. And you remember that was what most people said. I never expected a Black president in my lifetime. But I think in many ways we fail to recognize that if a movement was able to produce the impossible, then that movement would have to continue to put pressure on the individual who was elected to guarantee that our aspirations might be fulfilled in the future. And unfortunately, I think many of us assume that we had done what was necessary when we went to the polls and we went home. Now, the second condition I want to propose is the mobilizations that took place during that era of Occupy. It seems like Occupy was a long time ago, doesn't it? It was just a few years ago. All over the country and in many other parts of the world as well, linked to the demonstrations in Cairo and in Tunisia, what was called the Arab Spring. And because many people were expecting something more concrete, like an agenda, like a set of demands, and because there was no presentation of this organized agenda, many people argued that Occupy had failed once the encampments were broken down. But in the words of Stuart Hall, a great scholar activist who just recently passed, and I was actually in London also to participate in a memorial conference for him last week, he made the point that impact is often very different from outcome. That you cannot necessarily measure impact by looking at the specific outcomes. And so, what did Occupy teach us? That we could be critical of capitalism. As a matter of fact, more critical than we were allowed to be since perhaps the 1930s. And it also urged us to look at connections among movements and to recognize that perhaps the intersectionality of social justice struggles is what is most important during this era. There was the Oscar Grant case in Oakland. And of course, all of the organizing and demonstrations that took place, and a film came out of that case, Fruitvale Station, which has traveled all over the world. So Oscar Grant's name is known in many parts of the world. There was the Trayvon Martin case. And there had been many such cases before, but this case and the failure to convict George Zimmerman, and we're going to talk about the limitations of focusing only on individual perpetrators before the evening is over. But let me say, the failure to convict George Zimmerman helped to galvanize resistance all over the world. Trayvon Martin's name is known in Europe, in Australia, in Latin America, in Africa. And maybe some of you remember that during the very same period, Troy Davis was executed. Unfortunately, we could not save Troy Davis. But all over the country, people were saying, I am Troy Davis. I am Troy Davis. And that was, as a matter of fact, the largest anti-death penalty movement in recent times. With the Trayvon Martin case, the Troy Davis case, we saw the emergence of new activist formations. And I want to mention one, the Dream Defenders in Florida. They are doing absolutely amazing work. Young people who are traveling all over the country, sharing their ideas and sharing their strategies and encouraging young people to become activists in the cause of social justice. And so this summer, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, in a town of 20,000 people, right? And when his body was left on the street for 4.5 hours, people who had been sensitized to this problem of racist state violence, racist police violence, were driven to participate in the resistance. The hands up, don't shoot slogan circulated all over the world. And of course, the continuation of these mobilizations reached a peak in the response to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer who killed Michael Brown. And then shortly after that, we learned that a district attorney in New York had refused to get an indictment on the police officer in Pantaleo in Staten Island, whom we see on recorded images using a chokehold to get him down to the ground. And we all heard him saying many times, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." And so people all over the world are saying, "I can't breathe." And if you are on social media, and I suppose everyone to a certain extent is, you have heard, "I can't breathe," repeatedly. People are mobilizing in every major city. As a matter of fact, we're missing the demonstration in Oakland this evening because we're here. So why are we seeing these mobilizations now? There's some who assume that it is because so many Black men and boys have been killed within such a short period of time. But we need to correct that assumption. There has been an unbroken line of racist police killings since the era of slavery, as a matter of fact. In more recent times, there was the case of Emmett Till in August of 1955, which some of us are old enough to remember. And for others, it's a part of their historical memory. When I was active some years ago in Los Angeles SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that did all of the amazing work in the South, there was a Los Angeles chapter of SNCC. And one of our major cases involved the call for a people's trial of a white policeman who had killed a young Black man. And as a matter of fact, we had a tribunal, a people's tribunal at that point. And then later, when I became involved in the aftermath of my own trial in an organization called the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, this was during the 1970s, we organized tribunals around cases involving racist police crimes, as we called them, all over the country. We, as a matter of fact, created a panel of prominent international jurists who traveled from New York to Alabama to Texas, I believe, to the Bay Area. Now, the point that I want to make is that, unfortunately, killing young black men, black boys, is a routine occurrence. Robin Kelley, who teaches at UCLA, recently, well, in the last couple of weeks, wrote a very moving article for Counterpunch, which was reprinted, reissued on the list that Portside does. And the name of the article, the title of the article is Why We Won't Wait. And he points out that as we waited to hear the grand jury's decision around the case of Michael Brown, many black men and women were killed by the police. He points to Tamir Rice, whose name you may recognize. He was the 12-year-old in Cleveland who had the toy gun. But he also talks about Tanisha Anderson, a 37-year-old black woman who suffered from bipolar disorder. Excuse me, I picked up a cold in London. And as a matter of fact, how many black people with mental disorders are killed because the police officers don't stop to try to figure out what is going on? You may remember the case of the young black woman in Washington, D.C., who was driving erratically with her child in the back, and they killed her. So Robin Kelley goes on to mention another, a 40-year-old black woman in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who reportedly brandished a kitchen knife. In Chicago, a 19-year-old. In Utah, a 22-year-old. In Victorville, California, a 36-year-old black man who had been stopped while riding on his bike for suspicion of burglary. And it goes on and on and on. And the article says, as we waited, LAPD officers stopped 25-year-old Ezell Ford, a mentally challenged black man in his own South Los Angeles neighborhood, and shot him to death. He makes the point in that article, which I would urge you to look at. You can find it on Courtside or on Counterpunch online. Robin Kelley, Why We Won't Wait. And he pointed out that we were not really waiting for an indictment. Because we know that one indictment of one police officer is not going to alter a situation which has its roots in slavery and which is structural in character, which is systemic. It's not about bad individuals. And so simply indicting or even sending people to prison is not going to fundamentally change anything at all. As a matter of fact, if we remember, in the case of Oscar Grant, the BART policeman, Johannes Messerly, whom we also saw images of, there was an indictment. So what does it mean to get an indictment for the perpetrators? Not that we should not argue that there should be an indictment But in this case, there was, and Johannes Messerly was eventually convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 2 years and ended up doing 365 days. And now he recently testified in the civil suit that he was very sorry. And he broke down and cried in court. But he was also asked whether he apologized to Oscar Grant as Oscar Grant lay dying, and he did not. But let's ask the question, even if individual perpetrators are found guilty, what real difference does that make? And later, I want to talk a little bit about prison abolition and the argument that actually sending people to prison further reproduces the problem and often further reproduces the violence in which they are implicated. Which isn't to say that people should not be held accountable, whether they're police officers or not. So let's hold on to that idea and think about issues that move beyond the individual perpetrator. In the case of Ferguson, what has been so important is the fact that we witness the visual images of the Ferguson police force in all of their militarized gear. And so that means that in connection with that case, we have the demand for the demilitarization of police departments. And let us take into consideration the fact that the Sacramento Police Department has been the beneficiary of military gear and technologies and strategies. As a matter of fact, not only have all major police departments in this country benefited from the Department of Defense's excess property program, and that is what they call it, the excess property program, but also police departments on college and university campuses as well. So this is an issue that affects everyone in this country. And then if we look at the context within which this militarization of police departments has taken place, it has happened under the umbrella of the so-called war on terror. And the use of the war on terror as a broad designation of the project of 21st century Western democracy has, of course, its roots in the George Bush administration. You remember him? And the event that rescued him from mediocrity, which was the bombing of the Twin Towers, the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Now, this war on terror is as this sort of overarching designation of what Western democracy must do to save itself, has served as a justification of anti-Muslim racism. Because I would like us to see how these events, which we see as domestic events inside the US, are linked to what is happening in other parts of the world. So in talking about these conjunctures, we have to recognize that the degree to which anti-Muslim racism, or what is often referred to as Islamophobia, has swept the country and swept the countries of the global north in very dangerous ways. This project against terror has further legitimized the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And it's really interesting that during the demonstrations in Ferguson this summer, Palestinians watching the images, looking at the images, notice that the tear gas canisters, which were being used in Ferguson, were made by the same company as the tear gas in occupied Palestine. And as a matter of fact, many of the Palestinian activists tweeted advice to Ferguson demonstrators. They said things like, remember to not run against the wind. Don't be downwind of the tear gas, and use wet cloths. And they gave them all kinds of advice. So it's so interesting that there was this connection via social media, and many of us, I noticed that there are quite a number of people in the audience who are a little bit older than the social media generation. And sometimes we're not that willing to accept new developments. But something like that would have been inconceivable before the emergence of Facebook and Twitter. And parenthetically, whenever I'm asked about social media, I say that I think it's great. But we can't let the new technologies control us. We have to control them. We have to use them as opposed to allowing those technologies to use us. And oftentimes, they use us when we assume that all we have to do is like something on Facebook and we've done our duty to guarantee social justice. So in building communities of struggle and communities of resistance, we have to go a little bit further than pushing the button that says like. The global response to the police killing of a Black teenager in a small Midwestern town suggests that there is a growing consciousness all over the world regarding the persistence of US racism at a time when it's supposed to be on the decline. I had the opportunity in September to speak at an event in a very small town in Italy. I was in Savona, which is not too far from Genoa. Everybody knows Genoa, connected with Columbus, but let's not talk about Columbus right now. But I was invited there because they were holding an event on the Cuban Five, the 5 Cubans who were arrested and accused of terrorism when, as a matter of fact, they were attempting to prevent terrorist attacks on Cuba. And everyone wanted to know about Ferguson. Everyone. And as a matter of fact, this last week, I learned that there were many demonstrations in London, and on the campus at Oxford, there had been a number of demonstrations as well. So this notion that US racism is supposed to be on the decline, and I don't know how that could have happened. Perhaps there are more Black people who are in more powerful positions today than ever before. And it's true that 50 years ago, no one would have been able to imagine a Black president, or even Black people in the hierarchies of the capitalist economy in this country and in many other places. But all that tells us is that we have a rising Black middle class, a Black bourgeoisie. It doesn't tell us anything about the conditions of the majority of Black people. And those conditions, of course, are linked to poor people of all racial backgrounds, especially poor people of color, but also poor white people. Now, I thought I would speak a bit. I've already been speaking for over a half an hour. And there are a couple of things I really want to talk about. Okay, at this point, I was actually going to talk about the connection with the emergence of a prison industrial complex and an abolitionist position. But before I do that, let me just, for a few minutes, point out that we tend to separate different kinds of violence. And we tend to assume that there is no connection at all between state violence and violence that happens within intimate contexts. We tend to assume that there is no connection between the young Black man who is killed on the street and left for 4.5 hours by the police and the violence that is experienced by a young woman within an intimate relationship. And I don't have time to develop that argument to the fullest, but let me just ask you, how do people discover that violence can be used as a solution to any problems? Where does that idea come from? Somehow or another, we assume that the work that the military does, the work that prisons do, the work that police do, has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that, unfortunately, there are men and some women who resort to violence within relationships. Where do they learn that violence is possible? I'd just like you to think about that. How do perpetrators of intimate violence learn how to engage in practices of violence? Numerous scholarly studies have been done that indicate that there is a connection between violence that is perpetrated by the military and violence that soldiers end up using, unfortunately, against their loved ones. Or guards, prison guards. One of the things we discovered in doing this work against the prison industrial complex and calling for a moratorium on prison construction was that, as a matter of fact, when new prisons go up, especially in rural communities in California experienced that, particularly during the 1980s, which was the period of the emergence of global capitalism. Many people expected that the jobs problem would be solved. And that is why they called for prison construction, because the prison was going to bring new jobs. Well, oftentimes, the most senior guards from other parts of the state got those jobs. And what they discovered was that the incidence of domestic violence went up in the free community outside of the prison. So I want to propose another example of something that happened during this same period, but which did not receive nearly as much attention. We assume that it is Black men and boys who receive the brunt of the violence, and that is how we generally talk. But if one looks at the people who are most consistently subject to violence all over the world, as a matter of fact, it's women. And why is it that we have not acquired the language that allows us to make that connection? There was the case of Marissa Alexander in the very same jurisdiction where the Trayvon Martin case took place, who tried to use the same defense as George Zimmerman successfully used, the stand your ground defense. Because she had, wow, my voice is going, sorry. Because she had tried to protect herself from her abusive husband by shooting a gun in the air, not intending to hurt him or anyone, and no one was indeed hurt. During her first trial, she received 20 years. She was granted a second trial, which concluded last week. And the prosecutor, in the same district as Trayvon Martin's case, let it be known that the maximum sentence would be 60 years. And so she ended up making a plea bargain in which she got 2 years wearing an electronic bracelet. But still, 2 years subject to the power of the criminal justice system. Racial and sexual violence are connected. We might also, talk about violence that is directed against transgender people inside and outside of prison. Transgender women who cannot pass are the ones who are most likely to be subjected to police violence, vigilante violence, guard violence, and violence that emanates from other prisoners. And as a matter of fact, if we think about the fact that prisons are cauldrons of violence, as a matter of fact, sending someone to prison who has been convicted of a violent crime will no doubt make that person even more violent. Because we see the function of that institution as the reproduction of violence. And oftentimes it's assumed that those who are inside, the prisoners themselves, are just violent individuals. They're violent, and that's why there's so much violence in prisons, especially male prisons. That is why there's sexual violence. But as a matter of fact, if one looks more closely, one sees that the institution depends on that violence in order to control the populations. And so in many ways, the institution encourages that violence. And so what does it mean to send someone to prison who has been convicted, say, of domestic violence? And as a matter of fact, in the last 40 years, we've done an enormous amount of work to make more visible the harm that so many women experience. I mean, it used to be, of course, that the police would not even respond to domestic violence cases, or if they arrived and learned that it was happening within a relationship, they would say, oh, this is not a matter for the police, as if men were designated by the state to perpetrate the violence of punishment on the women in their lives. It's very complicated. So we can't just assume, or we cannot assume, that criminalizing gender violence is going to lead to a purging of our societies of this horrible harm. And it's actually, I think, one of the best arguments of abolition. Early on, there were many feminists who felt reluctant to support abolition because they pointed out, well, we've only begun to make it possible for violence against women to be recognized as a crime. So how can we say abolish prisons now? But these carceral feminisms, and this is a term that has recently emerged within academic circles, feminisms that depend on incarceration to solve the problems, are very much implicated in the fact that state violence has been on the rise. A wonderful book by a scholar activist by the name of Beth Ritchie, which is called Arrested Justice. Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and the Prison Nation. And that book is an attempt to argue that those carceral feminisms, she doesn't really use that term, are very much implicated in the buildup of the repressive apparatuses of the state, and certainly the racist use of these repressive apparatuses. Now, there are probably quite a number of issues that I would raise if I had more time. But I know we want to have an exchange, and I certainly don't want to prevent a conversation with the audience. So let me conclude by asking you whether we really want to be able to imagine the expansion of freedom and justice in the world. Whether we not only want an end to police violence, police crimes, racist violence in this country, but whether we want to think not only about young Black men, but whether we want to see the long history of the struggle for Black equality as being very much connected to other struggles for justice, not only in this country, but in other parts of the world. And so the struggle for justice for Black people has to be linked to the campaign to end the horrendous repression of undocumented people. And it's linked to, and as a matter of fact, when we think about the fact that Black people constitute such a disproportionate number of people in prison, and not only in men's prisons, but women's prisons as well. And let me just say parenthetically that the fact that we have men's prisons and women's prisons creates a structure that promotes the notion of a gender binary, and those people who do not identify as men or women end up being repressed by that very system, and that system, that carceral system, affects the ideologies that circulate in the free world. And then, of course, it's important to remember that historically, Black struggles for justice have been supported by people in every part of the world, everywhere. And as a matter of fact, in our era, our long era, the long 20th century, I would say, 21st century, the two figures that are perhaps most well known are Dr. Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. And the two struggles that have received universal solidarity have been the struggle for Black equality in the US and the struggle to bring down the system of apartheid in South Africa. And so I ask whether we want to be able to imagine the expansion of freedom and justice, not only here, but in other parts of the world. In South Africa, where unfortunately private prisons are expanding, and some of the same companies that own and operate private prisons in South Africa own and operate private prisons in Israel, where Palestinians are held. And so if we want to be able to imagine the expansion of freedom and justice in Palestine, in South Africa, in Colombia, in Europe, then we cannot go on as usual. We cannot pivot the center. We cannot be moderate. We have to be, and I love that term, militant pacifists. Militant pacifists. We have to be willing to stand up and say no with our combined spirits. And let me say that people of faith have a very special role to play in this. We have to be willing to stand up with our combined spirits, our collective intellects, and our many bodies. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's take some questions, and as usual, I'll be alternating men and women, and so if you want to ask a question, make your... Okay, Jim, it must be urgent.
Well, I didn't get my question in last time. Clearly, power responds to power, and things change when power arises. And power, traditionally in this country, arises through voting and through voter registration. In 1963, Bob and Dory Moon were registering voters in Mississippi. Should we refresh the strategy of having the opportunity to register to vote at every single demonstration on every topic?
Yeah, I think that's a good strategy. Yeah. But I don't think it will necessarily solve the problem. Well, it might be one of the step ones. When you say power responds to power, and you evoked Frederick Douglass in that notion that power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, and it never will. But sometimes that demand has to come from organized movements. I personally am someone who places even greater value in movements. Because if we have the right to vote, but there's no one to vote for, what difference does it make? So I want to think about it. I totally agree with you. And I'm someone who could not have voted in the city where I grew up, Birmingham, Alabama, who could not vote until the passage of the, well, as a matter of fact, even after the passage of the Voting Rights Acts. They still wouldn't allow black people to vote in Birmingham, Alabama. So I'm someone who passionately believes in the power of the vote. As Malcolm X? Well, Malcolm X said the ballot or the bullet. So I think I would say the ballot and the movement.
How was it to take over the Marin County courtroom?
Pardon me?
The Marin County courtroom?
Yeah. So what's the, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the.
How was it like?
Oh, well, I wasn't actually there. I wasn't actually there. And I was actually charged with some pretty terrible crimes, murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, because guns that were registered in my name were used in the Marin County takeover. And, it's really complicated to try to explain that, especially at a time when guns have produced so much harm and so much violence, where there are more guns in this country than there are people. During that period, many of us saw guns as symbolic of our right to defend ourselves. And my sister and I remember when we were growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, that my father had guns at home, which would only come out when the Ku Klux Klan would be in the neighborhood, or when, we grew up at a time when the Klan planted bombs across the street, and when there were constant threats. It was a reign of terror. And incidentally, when they talk about terror, they never talk about the history of the United States of America. And so, to tell you just a little bit of my history, I was, how can I make it really succinct? But my first job as a professor was at UCLA. I was hired by the philosophy department because they needed someone to teach Marxism. And that is what I had studied. I had studied in Germany. But then I was fired because I was a member of the Communist Party. And after that happened, I received scores and hundreds of threats from people who would write that or call in and say that I was going to be dead before sundown. So I had to have people who were protecting me. I had to have bodyguards all the time. I always point out that the UCLA police were really good. They accompanied me to my classes, and they would even start my car because sometimes there would be the possibility that someone had put a bomb in my car, and so they would ask me to stand behind a cement post while they started the car. But they always waved goodbye to me at the edge of campus. And I always assumed that they really wanted to make sure that I wasn't killed on campus. So it didn't matter what happened afterwards. And so I had a number of young men who did security for me, and the guns were registered in my name. And these are the guns that young Jonathan Jackson, who was totally connected to his brother, who had been in prison for 10 years, and who was very impatient, as 17-year-olds are. And so he was the one who went into the Marin County courthouse. But I should tell you that neither Jonathan or any of the other prisoners were responsible for killing anyone. It was the San Quentin guards, and we demonstrated this during my trial, who were responsible for killing everyone. Jonathan, the prisoners, as well as the judge who was killed. But as you can imagine, because the guns were registered in my name, I was the one who was targeted, and this is why I was eventually placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, because I did not, what was the term we used, Fania? You remember when we were talking about my refusing to surrender myself? I did not make myself available to the police. That is what we said during the trial. I did not make myself available to the police, and I ended up being on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Okay.
Hi, Angela. It's just a pleasure to be here and to hear you speak. And I think a lot of people are just not aware that of how big the prison industrial complex is. That 1/6 of all Americans have been incarcerated, and I think we have many times the guns in America than they do throughout the world. But I've often wondered what the motivating factors for you as a young person in the movement back in the 60s, which really was a scary, scary time. What was your motivating factors to continue, even though you were surrounded with terror and violence? What kept you going, and what motivated you?
Well, you know, you're right to point out that the U.S. prison industrial complex is actually the heart of a global prison industrial complex. It's here in the U.S., which has been called a prison nation, because it has the largest incarcerated population of any country in the entire world. Larger, both in terms of proportion and number, well, in terms of proportion, than the prison population was under apartheid in South Africa. But it's larger both in number and in terms of the per capita incarceration. The US has 25% of the world's imprisoned population. and 5% of the population at large. And the prison industry is centered in the US. The largest private prison corporations are headquartered here. Corrections Corporation of America was the first major large private prison company that it is headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee, and it owns and operates prisons all over the world. So yeah, that if we had time, I could explore the implications of that. But let me just say that the U.S. style prison is emerging everywhere, and particularly at a time when global capitalism produces surplus populations. And that's one of the reasons why you have so many people of color in prison in this country today. During the 1980s, when deindustrialization happened and many companies moved to other parts of the world where labor is cheaper, you remember when we used to have a really vibrant auto industry? And people, especially black people in Detroit, were doing really well because of the auto industry. And look at Detroit today. It's like a ghost town. Birmingham, which had a steel industry. The only steel mill left is a museum that shows you how they used to make steel. And when all of these industries shut down and with nothing to replace them, you had the emergence of these populations that became surplus populations. Populations that could not be exploited for their labor because there were no jobs. And then because of the structural adjustment and the dismantling of the welfare state and the moving of capital into profitable areas, the educational opportunities that used to be there began to decline. Welfare, so you had huge numbers of women. As a matter of fact, the women's population in prison all over the world is the fastest growing sector of the imprisoned population. So we can talk about all of these economic causes, that the articulation of economic conditions with the already existing racism that made this prison industrial complex so profitable. So profitable. And when you have companies, corporations, and people in politics and people in the media that have stakes in the continued existence of a large prison population, it no longer becomes about crime and punishment. And this is happening now all over the world. The U.S. has provided a model. In Africa now, you see huge prisons developing. In South America, in Colombia, the largest prison in South America is being constructed with the aid of the United States government. So, yeah. But you wanted to know how I've been able to continue all these years. And I don't know if I have an answer for that, except to say that I'm not an individual who has continued this work. I'm a part of a community that has continued that work. I don't know whether individuals can sustain themselves doing anything as individuals alone. And in this era of global capitalism, in this era of neoliberalism, we assume that we can find the answer to everything in the individual. And we sometimes forget to look at the ways in which individuals are deeply informed by communities. And I would say I owe everything to my various communities. Perhaps I would have stopped a long time ago if other people hadn't continued to do the work. My sister who's here, my sister's, she used to be the younger sister. Well, she still is the younger sister, but well, we've grown closer in age as the years have gone by. And, when I was in jail, she traveled all over the world. Oftentimes I visit places and they say, "Oh, you were here in 1970. I said, no, I was in jail in 1970. It must have been my sister. And so, she did that really important work and then continued to practice civil rights law, another arena of struggle, and now she's involved in restorative justice. And I think Pastor Jones said it's my sister who's the expert on restorative justice. I totally believe in restorative justice processes, but the organization that she founded, which is called Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, has done a great deal to reduce and minimize violence in Oakland schools. And when she speaks, she talks about the fact that it's not only necessary to address the children themselves, the students, but it's necessary to train the teachers, because the teachers use punitive methods, which sends a message to the students that it's okay to use those kind of repressive tactics, and therefore they resort to violence. So you could also ask her. And then I could talk about other people. I could talk about people who are much older than I am. One of the very close, my late mother's best friend, who is almost 100. She'll be 100 in March. She became active as a teenager. And she still is an active participant in social justice struggles. And I bet she was out there in one of those demonstrations in New York, because that is what she does. And so this is how we live our lives.
Yes, along the line of how we got to be such a prison industrial nation, a lot of the military equipment and so forth began when the war on drugs began, and the powerful relationship between the wide sweeping ability to just arrest you in a traffic stop for drug abuse, and then the prosecutor's role in making sure that there was a major sentence for that. Could you talk a little bit about the new Jim Crow?
Yeah. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, is a really powerful examination of the connection between historical modes of racism, the emergence of what she calls racial class systems in the past, and a racial class system that is produced by this process of mass incarceration. And so she argues, for example, that there are more Black men in prison and on parole, that is to say, under the control of criminal justice agencies today than there were enslaved in 1850. And that's a very dramatic idea. So her argument is that this mass incarceration, this drive towards mass incarceration, has produced a new system of segregation, a new system of racism, a new system of Jim Crow, not only with respect to what people experience in prison, but especially with respect to what they experience when they are released. And so she talks about felony disenfranchisement. If we struggle for the right to vote as one of the ways of extricating ourselves from the historical Jim Crow, then we have to recognize the extent to which people who have spent time in prison in many states are divested of the right to vote and of other civil rights. As a matter of fact, there is a legal term that is connected with the social death of slavery, slavery as social death. And you can read Orlando Patterson's book, Slavery and Social Death. I unfortunately don't have time to explicate it entirely. But the civil death, it's connected to the civil death that is produced by imprisonment, which means that in many states, prisoners forever lose the possibility of being full citizens. And so her argument is very powerful. She argues that, of course, it was the war, so-called war on drugs that drove this. And in many, she's absolutely right. As a matter of fact, in many ways, the war on drugs was a war on black people. And brown people as well, yeah. But if we're looking at the connections between the old Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow, and so the argument is that the war on drugs drove this, and if one looks, of course, at actual studies, one discovers that black and brown people do drugs at about the same rate as white people, white youth, and sell drugs at the same rate. So if white youth are doing drugs and selling drugs, how come it is that black and brown people are the ones who end up in prison? Well, you'll see one of the reasons is because there's surveillance in those communities. As a matter of fact, I wanted to tell you to look online for a very interesting Twitter conversation that is going viral. And it's called Criming While White. Criming While White. And it's all of these white people who have written in to describe the crimes that they committed. And they not only never got caught, but even the ones who got caught were let go. One person said that he and a black friend were charged with stealing a candy bar. And the cop gave him, the white person, the candy bar. And the black person ended up being sentenced to 20 years. So look at it. It's a really interesting conversation. You know, whether some of these things may, not be, but the fact that people feel compelled to point out the disparate treatment, the racially motivated disparities in police treatment. And so this is what we're talking about with respect to the use of the war on drugs. But I would also say, and Michelle Alexander also acknowledges this, that we can't only look at the particular domestic conditions. We have to look at what has happened globally. And that is why I'd like to ask us to look at the emergence of global capitalism in the 1980s. What period was that? That was the Reagan-Bush years, the first Bush. You remember him? Ronald Reagan. So look at the damage that was done then. That is the period when we see this prison construction all over the country. In California, there were like about 10 or 11 prisons for many, many, many decades. Within one decade, the number went up to something like 33, 32 or 33. And so one sees this happening all over the country. And therefore, you see, I always really like to think about our situation here in the US as a part of a global situation. And we are encouraged to think of this country as so special, you know, that it's an exception. We don't have to put ourselves in the context of what is happening elsewhere. What is happening elsewhere is always only a function of what happens here. And sometimes those of us who are progressive and radical make the same mistake. And so that is why, you know, I like to, you know, think about the connections between what was happening here and what was happening in Vietnam at that time, or what was happening in the maquiladoras along the, you know, the border, the connection between the immigration that was stimulated by the development of global capital. Because when global capitalism emerges, capital starts to travel like crazy across national borders, and everything else starts to travel, and information starts to travel. But then when people start to travel, which is inevitable, they're called illegal. And so the issue of the violation of immigrant rights in this country is linked to what is happening in the global north elsewhere. It's linked to the terrible repression that immigrants from Africa and the Middle East and Asia are experiencing in Germany or in France. And we have to figure out how to become a part of that global community of struggle.
Dr. Davis, you talked a lot about the movement tonight, and so I want to get a little bit more clarification about whether you think simply the protests are sufficient for it to be a part of the movement. You talked about how Occupy may have been viewed as not being successful, and when we talk about how much the economics are intertwined with the racism and unequal treatment of all peoples of color, are the protests enough? And if there should be more to be a part of the movement that you're talking about?
I think that's a really good question. And yes, I think there should be more. But I also think that just because things are happening differently from the way they happened in the 50s and the 60s, we should not discount what is happening. I have always believed in independent politics. And I always point out that the very first time I ever voted for, I never would have voted for a Republican anyway, but the very first time I voted for a Democrat was when I voted for Barack Obama. Because I always voted, you know, Communist Party, Peace and Freedom Party, the Green Party. And I still very much believe in independent politics. So I think we are going to need some kind of a political party that is not beholden to the corporations in the same way that the Democratic Party is, and of course the Republican Party. One of the reasons we should have known from the very outset that Obama was not going to be able to realize our dreams and aspirations was because he was in the Democratic Party. We should have recognized that from the beginning. Now, which isn't to say, I know there are a lot of Democrats in the House. It isn't to say that it's not important to engage in struggles within the Democratic Party. Arenas of struggle are everywhere. And that to me is what a movement is all about. when the work is being done, when the work is not just the protests and the mobilizations in the streets, but when organizing work is happening in churches, when it's happening on campuses, when it's happening in labor unions, when it's happening in communities, when it's happening in schools, when it's happening, all over. That, to me, is what a movement is all about. And I think we have the foundation for a movement today. We have the terrain. This is a particular conjuncture that allows for the building of a movement, and maybe even the imagining of and creation of a foundation for a better politics, so that we can vote for somebody that we truly believe in. But here we are right now at this moment. And my sense has always been that we never use what is not possible at a given moment as an excuse for not doing anything.
Amen. Dr. Davis, our time has sort of run out here, but you're doing really well considering the jet lag. I just want to congratulate. I see two more questions.
Okay, that's fine.
Can we do two more?
Sure.
Hello, Dr. Davis. I'm getting ready to graduate from middle school this year. And in history class, we're learning about our government and how my history teacher told me that Obama proposed that he's going to try and give 5 million illegal immigrants citizenship. And why are 16 of our states saying that it's unconstitutional?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Yeah. What is so interesting is that undocumented people, and that's a term I prefer to illegal immigrants, because within those circles, the most important slogan is, no human being is illegal. No human being is illegal. And so we talk about people who do not have papers. In France, they talk about the sans-papiers, which means without papers. But that doesn't mean that people who do not have the evidence, the physical evidence of citizenship, are not the best citizens one can find. And I think that so many of the youth who have stood up, the dream dreamers, the dream defenders came out of Florida, but the dreamers who have been coming out as undocumented and who have been doing hunger strikes and all kinds of things over the last period are some of the most inspiring young people I have ever met. And I can tell you that I felt really honored, I think it was 2 years ago, when I was invited to speak at the West Coast Dream graduation. So these were undocumented young people who had graduated from high school and college, who had this collective ceremony, graduation, in front of Civic Center in San Francisco. And I have never experienced such a moving moment. So yes, Obama should take even bolder positions because he hasn't gone far enough, as far as I'm concerned. He hasn't gone nearly far enough. But I think your question is correct. Why cannot these states recognize how important it is to affirm people as human beings, many of whom are doing so much more for this country than those who do have papers? And so yeah, let's look at some of those states and let's ask what, the Arizona. Don't let me start talking about Arizona. But yeah, keep asking those questions.
Hello, Professor Davis. I guess my question is, you spoke, of course, about our current things happening over in Missouri, New York, and the protests, and also about the idea of militant pacifism. How do we kind of combine, those two things as we go forward in regard to response and really
Militance and
forward?
pacifism?
Yes.
Well, pacifism can be constructed very broadly in terms of not believing in war as a solution, not believing in violence as a solution. And I think it is possible to be very militant in the defense of that stance. And, oftentimes, most of the public conversations around violence have to do with individual violences. Who was it? I was actually, I think, reading in the same article that I referred to earlier by Robin Kelly, who points out that one of the conservative, it wasn't Rush Limbaugh, but someone like him. Who was it? Anyway, he made a comment to another scholar, Michael Dyson, with whom he was, it was O'Reilly, maybe it was O'Reilly, maybe it was, I don't, I shouldn't say that they're all the same to me, but but he said something like, the police never would have been in Ferguson if your people weren't killing themselves. And somehow or another, it's always those who are the recipients of those ideologies, the victims of those ideologies, including those who use very inappropriate forms of violence to express themselves, whether it's gun violence. And I truly believe, I should have said this when I answered the young man's question about the Marin County courtroom, that we have to get rid of guns in this society. We should disarm the entire country. But that also means that we should disarm the police. But you see, if nobody has guns, then perhaps we would try to figure out how to resolve these issues in restorative justice ways. And my sister wrote an article, which you can find on, what's the name of it, Fania? The one in Truth Out. Okay, then the title of her article is Ferguson Cries Out for Truth and Reconciliation. And it's online in either Yes magazine or Truth Out. Some of you probably follow Truth Out. Yeah, I think it is possible to be a militant pacifist. I was, as I said earlier at the beginning, I was just in Oxford and participated in a debate with Cornel West. We were on the same team. marking the 50th anniversary of Malcolm X's appearance at the Oxford Union Debating Society. And 50 years ago, Malcolm X was called upon to debate the proposition. The House motion was, this House believes that extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and that moderation in defense of justice is no virtue. Which was great, but I have to say parenthetically, which is really weird, that it was Barry Goldwater who said that 50 years ago. In defense of the John Birch Society and its racist and anti-Semitic positions. So we had to make that point. But then at the same time, we had to argue that it was possible to go to extreme measures in the defense of liberty. And some of the non-violent ways in which people have done this, and I gave some of these examples in my contribution to the debate, was that during slavery, when people stole their own bodies, because when they escaped, they were stealing the master's property. And that was an extreme measure. And that I also used as another example when the Children's Crusade happened in Birmingham, and even Malcolm X said that it was wrong to allow children to face the police dogs and the high-power fire hoses. But if it weren't for the Children's Crusade, and they were courageous, I mean, they were militant pacifists because they were trained in nonviolence, and they stood up to the dogs, and they stood up to the high-power police, high-power fire hoses, and they went to jail by the hundreds. And it was those televised images all over the world that dramatically demonstrated, what the system of segregation was in those days. And without the children being involved in that way, I don't know how far that movement would have developed. And they were certainly militant pacifists. Thank you very much.
Dr. Davis, how do we thank you? You have blessed us richly. You have been generous to us. You have challenged us. You've educated us. You've pushed us. And I am deeply grateful. I love the fact that you ended up with militant pacifists. And I also love the fact you acknowledged the number of gray hair heads around the room. But I want to acknowledge I have never seen as many children and young people at a Moon Lecture as I see tonight. Thank you, families, parents who brought them.